Okay, so welcome friends once again for a BOA PG session. So we have with us Dr. Gargi Merchant, who is going to speak on third and fourth nerve palsy, a very important topic in Viva as well as short notes. You may even get a long answer question. So Dr. Just to introduce Dr. Gargi, she is a gold medalist for her MS as well as DOMS exams, and she has done her pediatric fellowship from Arvind Eye Hospital. Also, she has done a course in ROP, which is a topic of her interest from LV Prasad. She is a private practitioner and has her clinic, Siddhant Eye Clinic, at Andheri. So, thank you, Gargi, for taking up this lecture, and I request you to start the lecture right away.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Swapnish, for the kind introduction. Good evening, friends. So I would be going in forward with third and fourth nerve palsy. Before we go specifically on these two nerves, I would like to introduce something about paralytic strabismus. So what do you mean by a paralytic strabismus? It is a strabismic deviation which is caused by paralysis or one or more of the extraocular muscles. The important part is the deviation will differ in different directions of gaze. The measurement depends also on which eye is fixing. So this is a general rule for all kinds of paralytic strabismus. So most common causes would be third nerve, fourth nerve, and a sixth nerve palsy. There are certain clinical features which are pertinent to any kind of paralytic strabismus. They would be diplopia, past pointing. There would be abnormal head posture. If it's in children, we are expecting suppression, abnormal retinal correspondence, amblyopia. The secondary deviation is always greater than the primary deviation. However, over a period of time, we are expecting spread of cometons. So if you want to differentiate clinically whether it's a palsy or it's a restrictive strabismus like thyroid ophthalmopathy, you need to do certain tests. Most important would be a force duction test. A force duction test would be negative in cases of palsy and it would be positive in cases of restrictive strabismus. The saccadic velocity slows down in palsies, however, it remains unaffected with restrictive strabismus. So the third cranial nerve, we go on to that. It's entirely motor in function. All extraocular muscles except superior oblique and lateral rectus are supplied by this nerve. It also supplies levator palpebrae superioris of the upper lid and the intraocular muscles, which include sphincter pupillae and the ciliary muscle for accommodation. Now, etiology of nerve palsy can be either be congenital or acquired. Acquired, the causes would be trauma, vascular, or compressive. Now, going a bit on the anatomy of the third nerve before we discuss the clinical syndromes, the nucleus of third nerve lies at the level of superior colliculus in the midbrain. The course of the third nerve can be divided into fascicular part, a basilar part, a cavernous part, and an intraorbital part. So a small diagram depicting it. This is the third nerve nucleus. This is the midbrain. Now the nerve is passing right across the red nucleus, passing through the motor fibers which are present here in the cerebral peduncle, going between the two arteries, superior cerebellar and the posterior basal cerebral artery, runs parallel to posterior communicating artery, then enters the cavernous sinus as you can see. Now from the cavernous sinus, you are seeing that in the cavernous sinus, it is along with the fourth nerve, the first part of the trigeminal nerve. This would form the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. The medial wall of the cavernous sinus will be with an internal carotid artery and the sixth nerve. The reason to depict the diagram is to show that isolated third nerve palsy is practically not possible if the lesion is in cavernous sinus. So since we have understood the anatomy, we go to the fascicular lesions. We have something called as the Benedict syndrome, where there is ipsilateral third nerve palsy and contralateral extrapyramidal signs because red nucleus is involved. We have Weber syndrome with ipsilateral third nerve palsy and a contralateral hemiparesis because the motor fibers supplying the opposite limb are involved. We have North-Nagel syndrome, where there is ipsilateral third nerve palsy and ipsilateral cerebellar ataxia. Why ipsilateral cerebellar ataxia? Because cerebellar fibers are ipsilateral and superior cerebellar peduncle is involved in this case. And then we have something called cloud syndrome, where we have ipsilateral third nerve palsy and contralateral ataxia with tremors. So lesions in the basilar region, this is of interest because isolated third nerve palsies are most commonly basilar. Important causes are aneurysm, as we saw that the nerve runs really parallel to the posterior communicating artery. So aneurysm will be an important cause. Second cause could be head trauma causing an extradural or a subdural hematoma. The pupillomotor fibers are of special interest in the basilar region. They are located superficially between the brainstem and the cavernous sinus. The blood supply of these pupillomotor fibers is from pial blood vessels. However, the rest of the nerve is supplied by the vasa nervorum. This has clinical implications as we move on later. So as we can see, these are the pupillary fibers which are really medial, superficial, and the pial blood vessels are supplying it. And the internal part or the rest of the nerve would be supplied by the vasa nervorum. Then we have intracavernous lesions. We would not have an isolated nerve palsy, but we would be having involvement of fourth, sixth, and first division of fifth nerve. Diabetes is an important cause. Pituitary apoplexy, aneurysms, meningioma, and carotid cavernous fistula are the other causes. Once it has entered the superior orbital fissure, it would be dividing into two parts, the superior division and the inferior division. So the causes of third nerve palsy here could be trauma, it could be ischemic, it could be neoplastic or inflammatory in the orbit. So going on to the clinical features of third nerve palsy, we have a variable amount of ptosis with pupil involvement or without pupil involvement. I'm going to the congenital third nerve palsy first. They have exotropia and hypotropia because only the lateral rectus and superior oblique are functioning. They have a head posture with chin elevation mainly because of ptosis, plus a contralateral face turn is present. There is loss of binocular vision and amblyopia, which is very important in children, so you need to operate them early. The acquired third nerve palsy, the clinical features are almost similar. Most important complaint that they say is diplopia, except if there is severe ptosis. There is external ophthalmoplegia. It can be a pupil sparing or a pupil involving third nerve palsy. So these are some of the pictures showing third nerve palsy. It's the right third nerve which is affected. So you see right complete ptosis. When you lift the lid up, you are seeing exotropic as well as a hypotropic eye. Adduction, elevation, as well as depression is restricted. A similar picture showing right third nerve palsy with the right eye being in exotropia.
So Gargi,
Yeah.
just to give them a small mnemonic, would it be right to say that all patients where there is lid drooping and the eye is down and out,
right,
would be third nerve?
Yeah, it is.
So
with ptosis and with a drooping eye and the eye being out and down, it would be a third nerve palsy.
So I had a mnemonic during my PG days that the eyelid is drooping with the eye down and out.
Right.
So that stayed in my mind. So just a cue to remember for the PGs.
Correct. Absolutely right. Then we go on to aberrant regeneration of third nerve, which can be seen in congenital cases or post-trauma or post-neoplastic cases. Now, these have some atypical signs like pseudographase sign. That means there is elevation of lid when you try adducting. Basically, it is misdirection or miswiring of the nerves. The nerve which is going to supply the adductor muscle or the medial rectus is also now supplying the levator palpebrae. So, and the lid. So it's going up. We can have widening of the palpebral fissure on adduction. We have pseudo-Argyll-Robertson pupil sign. That means when you are trying to adduct, you have constriction of the pupil. Plus we can have retraction and adduction on attempted upgaze. A case of clinical value 61-year-old male had sudden onset of headache. It was accompanied by double vision. However, the double vision became better, but the headache still persisted. The visual acuity was normal. Pupil was moderately dilated, poorly reactive. Now, if you see, he's got right eye ptosis. When you lift the lid, you have a dilated pupil. Now, there was pain and diplopia for 12 hours. Now, what are we going at? How do we distinguish whether it's an aneurysmal third nerve palsy or a ischemic or a diabetic third nerve palsy, which is less urgent? So one factor is pain. Pain definitely would be absent in ischemic kind of nerve palsies, but 99% times pain would be present with aneurysmal third nerve palsy. However, the most distinguishing feature is that of the pupils. So any patient complaining with headache, you should check the pupils. Now, as we saw in the previous anatomy, the pupillomotor fibers are located on the medial superficial surface in the basilar course. And if a posterior communicating artery aneurysm is growing, it would be compressing on the third nerve. So pupil dilatation before or with ptosis and diplopia is indicative of a more urgent cause of third nerve palsy, that is an aneurysmal cause. Now, ischemia is usually central and the pupil is not affected. That means in cases of hypertension or diabetes, we are not expecting pupil to be involved. So a general rule, pupil abnormal, think of aneurysm. Pupil normal, think of ischemia. However, there is an exception to the rule. It applies only to complete motor palsies with completely normal pupils. We do have to take history that the patient did not have previous history of trauma or anything. The rule applies then only. The differential diagnosis of the third nerve palsy would be myasthenia gravis, because any extraocular muscle could be affected in myasthenia gravis. However, one rule is pupil is never affected with myasthenia gravis. Second, it could be thyroid associated orbitopathy. You have to do a force duction test to distinguish it from third nerve palsy. It could be CPEO or chronic progressive external ophthalmoplegia, or it can be idiopathic orbital inflammatory disease. So how will you manage any paralytic strabismus? Evaluation is extremely important because it is often secondary to other causes which are amenable to treatment. Life-saving, that's important. It's not only about the eye, it's about life-saving procedures. So you should you should always take the blood pressure, a blood sugar, and a neuro evaluation. A tensilon test should be done to rule out myasthenia gravis. So neuroimaging is a must, except if it's an elderly patient greater than 50 years old, you know he's got a history of hypertension or diabetes, pupil is not involved. Otherwise, neuroimaging is required. So between MRI or CT, so MRI is more sensitive for non-aneurysmal causes. It does not require contrast. There is less radiation exposure. However, it's more expensive and takes more time. CT, the advantages are fast acquisition times. Most of the places it's available. More anatomic detail is there. However, we are exposing them to a large contrast load and a large radiation exposure. So once neuroimaging is done and you are following up these patients of third nerve palsy, we go on to the next modality, which is a Hess chart. Now, even though Hess chart is not important for diagnosis, it's very, very important for the follow-up of these patients because we want to see whether they are improving or not. So now this is a case where we are seeing that there is restriction in elevation, restriction in adduction, restriction in depression. So, and the lateral rectus is in the superior oblique are working fine. So we are seeing a picture of third nerve palsy. However, over a period of say 4 months or 6 months, this could become better. And by measuring how much it's becoming better, we can advise these patients whether you should go in for surgery or you should not go in for surgery. So treatment for third nerve palsy, less invasive remedies should be tried at first. In first 3 to 4 months, what I give them is just plain occlusion if diplopia is there, or frosted glasses is an option. That means you frost the glass which is covering the deviated eye. We can give prisms for small deviation, Botox injections, but they are just temporary. In children, it's very important to take care of amblyopia. So children, we do think about getting the strabismus corrected and at least lifting the lid up before they become amblyopic. Surgery for alignment we do after 6 months. We definitely do a force reduction test to rule out any kind of restriction. Now, there is no actual cure for any kind of nerve palsy. So the precise goal should be made clear to the patient that we are going to do a surgery just so that the ocular alignment in primary and down gaze would be the priority. Achieving alignment in all gazes is just not going to be possible, and normal ocular motility, to give them the full ocular motility, is going to be unlikely. So when some medial rectus function is remaining and we have a horizontal deviation, we do just a large recess resect procedure. We keep them on adjustable suture because we cannot predict how much of medial rectus function is actually going to be there. If it's a complete palsy and involving, and in the involved eye, we can do something called as LRD activation. That means we are actually putting the lateral rectus and attaching it to the lateral orbital wall. However, by doing this, we are telling the patient that you will look cosmetically good in the primary gaze. We are also crippling your abduction along with the other things. If the involved eye is hypo, we can do a esotenotomy or an inferior rectus recess and a superior rectus resection. The golden rule is after the strabismus is corrected, then only we will do in a ptosis surgery. Because just doing a frontalis sling would be causing lot of corneal exposure if the eye can just not go up. In isolated muscle palsies, if you have single muscle palsies which are involved, like superior rectus palsy, we do simple recess resect procedure and it works well. So once the third nerve is done, we go on to the fourth nerve. Now, fourth nerve, a little bit on the anatomy again. The trochlear nerve arises from the trochlear nucleus of the midbrain, that is at the level of inferior colliculus. There is certain important thing about the anatomy. It is the only cranial nerve to exit from the posterior midbrain, and it is the only nerve to cross. It runs anteriorly, goes within the subarachnoid space, and it goes into the dura mater of the sphenoid bone. The nerve then goes along the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, where it is along with third nerve, fifth nerve part 1 and the sixth nerve, and then it enters the orbit. So this is a diagram showing. So if you see, it's going right dorsally in the midbrain. It is crossing well, then running alongside the third nerve, entering the cavernous sinus. So etiology of fourth nerve palsy in patients who are older than 50 years, we are expecting a microvascular ischemic disease like BP or diabetes. The fourth nerve is particularly vulnerable to closed head cranial trauma due to the unique dorsal midbrain crossing anatomy. It can be damaged with diseases which are happening in the subarachnoid space or cavernous sinus, like inflammatory fistulas, aneurysms, or space occupying lesions. A lot of fourth nerve palsies are congenital. So what are the clinical features of fourth nerve palsy? We are expecting diplopia in looking down. That's the most common thing with what the patients come with, especially when they are walking down the stairs or they are reading a book, they see double. When we do the check the versions and the adductions, we see there is weakness of the superior oblique, which is a depressor and an intortor. We are seeing ipsilateral hypertropia with excyclotorsion. And there is something called as classical contralateral head tilt. In children, it may be the sole presenting feature. You may not find anything else except just a contralateral head tilt. So if we want to rule out torticollis, whether it's congenital or ocular torticollis, there are certain points. That because of muscle problem or the congenital one, it happens during the first 6 months of birth. And ocular rarely presents before 18 months after birth. Head position, we see in congenital torticollis, passive or voluntary straightening of the head is difficult or impossible. However, it can be easily done with the ocular torticollis. The neck muscles are very much hardened with congenital torticollis, and it's negative with ocular torticollis. Vision wise, we see no visual disturbances with congenital torticollis. However, in ocular torticollis, diplopia occurs when the head is straightened or tilted to the opposite side. On occluding one eye, we see that this type of torticollis or the congenital torticollis is just not changed. However, with ocular torticollis, we are expecting the head to straighten by occluding the paretic eye, except if it's really long standing and some structural changes have already taken place. So the most important clinical test to find out whether it's a fourth nerve palsy or not is a Bilchowski head tilt test with the Parkes modification. So what do you do in this? Basically, what you are doing is nothing, doing an alternate cover test with the prisms, and you're measuring deviation. In the step 1, you are measuring hypertropia in the primary gaze. So that would give you in 2 pairs of muscles in each eye, whether the depressors are not working in one eye or the elevators are not working in the other eye. Then you take the same kind of measurement again in the right gaze and the left gaze. And after that, you do the step 3, where you give in a head tilt test. Now, in the head tilt test, you can, when you tilt the head on one particular side, the side that you have bent your head, that side of the eye is going to intort, and the eye which is on the opposite side is going to extort. That's the basis of the head tilt test. We can have bilateral fourth nerve palsy, which can be a bit more challenging. You have crossed hypertropia, that is the right eye is higher on left gaze and the left eye is higher on the right gaze when you do the Bilchowski test. There is excyclotorsion of 10 degrees or greater. So how do you do that? Subjective torsion you can measure with a double Maddox rod testing, or objective torsion you can see on indirect ophthalmoscopy. Now there will be a large or a greater than 25 prism diopter of V pattern strabismus. When both the superior obliques are involved, we are expecting V pattern esotropia. And there is a chin down head posture to compensate for this bilateral fourth nerve palsy. So how do you evaluate? It will be checking the versions, that is true for any strabismus. You do the 3-step test, very, very important. That's how you will land up with a fourth nerve palsy. Like if you suppose have a right superior oblique palsy, we are expecting that the right hypertropia would be increasing on left gaze and would be increasing on right head tilt. The patient would be probably be presenting you with a left head tilt. We do a double Maddox rod test to the patient. Put in the Maddox rod. We do it with 2 red Maddox rods placed vertically, that means oriented at 90 degree. And then we ask the patient actually to move in the lens so that they see both the lines horizontal, and that would be giving you the amount of torsion. And evaluation of torsion with indirect ophthalmoscopy is very, very important, because sometimes you may not rely on the subjective test. So normally we see that the foveal reflex, normally when you're doing IO, lies between the upper part and the first 1/3 of the disc. However, if the foveal reflex goes above I mean it goes above the upper part of the disc, when you are doing IO, you are expecting a excyclotorsion.
Gargi,
Yeah.
In double Maddox rod test, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So when you said that the intorsion has to be measured,
right,
is it true that if the intorsion is less than 10 degrees, it is
right,
always a unilateral palsy? And if the intorsion is more than 10 degrees, it is a bilateral superior oblique palsy, or
if
it is?
yeah, it's almost universal that if it is more than 10 degrees of torsion, we are expecting a bilateral palsy.
Okay.
Yeah. So differential diagnosis would be skew deviation. Skew deviation would, however, you will be seeing hypertropia again. However, it will be associated with other brainstem thalamic signs or cerebellar signs. And most important, torsion will be absent with skew deviation. So you do an indirect ophthalmoscopy, you can rule out skew deviation. It can be thyroid related ophthalmopathy, but you should do a FDT and you should get a thyroid profile done. Sometimes it can be just primary inferior oblique overaction and nothing else. Now, how this is sometimes associated, especially in children, with congenital esotropia. So in these cases, we are not going to see primary hyperdeviation at all. We see hypertropia only when the child or the adult is looking up and in. So that would help you to rule out primary inferior oblique overaction. Now, how do you manage fourth nerve palsy? There are certain rules that we follow for fourth nerve palsy. I'm just going a bit more superficially because you would not be asked absolutely into the surgical details. If the deviation is greatest in the field of superior oblique, by the field of superior oblique, I mean if you depress the eye and you adduct it inside and you feel that the hypertropia is coming much more, we would be planning a SO tuck. However, definitely we will be seeing whether the SO tendon is lax or not. If the deviation is greatest in the field of inferior oblique, we would be going in just for a plain inferior oblique recession. However, if we see that it's equal in both the fields and the deviation is greater than 30 prisms, we do both SO tuck with IO recession. So NAP has classified, and I guess in exams you would be getting this. So if it is more in the inferior oblique, the hyperdeviation in the area of inferior oblique, just weaken the inferior oblique. If it is in the area of superior oblique, that is the eye is depressed and adducted and you are getting a hyperdeviation, just tuck the superior oblique. However, that is if it is lax. If the hypertropia is less than 20 prisms and this entire adduction field is affected, you can weaken the ipsilateral inferior oblique, and it's greater than 20 prism diopter, you can do a SO tendon tuck and weaken the ipsilateral inferior oblique, or you can weak the contralateral inferior rectus also. Now in the fourth part of NAPS classification, we have if the hyperdeviation measured is much more in adduction as well as depression, what we would be doing is weakening the ipsilateral inferior oblique and the ipsilateral superior rectus if it's less than 20 prisms. If it's greater than 20 prisms, we add tucking of superior oblique tendon. If it's only in the depressor field or the lower field that the hyperdeviation is seen more, what we would be doing is just recessing the ipsilateral superior rectus and the yoke contralateral inferior rectus. So there is one separate entity called torsional strabismus with fourth nerve palsy, where it's much more torsion that is affected than there being a vertical component to the palsy. So the people would come in with the complaint that they are seeing tilting of objects and not really up and down. Now for this kind of strabismus, we do something called as the Hurda-Ito procedure. Now that's because the superior oblique has a unique anatomy where anterior 1/3 of the fibers are responsible only for the torsion, whereas the posterior 2/3 of the fibers are mainly responsible for the vertical component, that is the hypertropia. So in Hurda-Ito procedure, we'll just be advancing the anterior 1/3 of the fibers 8 mm behind the lateral rectus, and that would take care of the torsional strabismus. So conclusion, for any paralytic strabismus, it is a challenge both in diagnosis and management. We should analyze using full scope of tests and maneuvers to arrive at a correct diagnosis. Always look in for underlying systemic disease. Neuroevaluation is a must if you can't find any systemic diseases. Surgical management challenges us to maximize motility and alignment with a fewer normally functioning muscles. Thank you.
Thank you, Gargi. You can stop the screen share.
Yeah.
Then we'll take on the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the PGs, I would request them the diagrams which she showed. And if I'm wrong, correct me. They were from Kansky.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, so they are very classic diagrams, and try to draw them again and again, because that is the only way that you will remember the lesions, the pathway, and at least it helped for most of us that those who had those diagrams at the back of their hand, they could answer these questions quite fluently, even in theory as well as in Viva. And they definitely, a good diagram definitely will carry you some brownie points in the paper.
Correct.
and create as many mnemonics as you want, because that is the only way to remember these things. One of them is SINRAT. When you spoke about SO palsy, so immediately you can remember that SIN means superiors are intorters, and SO4 LR6.
LR6.
So it's in at least that much I can remember.
Correct.
So let's take the questions. So the first question is from Dr. Preeti Wadekar. Can you explain the procedure for Hess charting?
Yeah, I can explain the procedure. So with the Hess charting, what you are doing is, if you have ever seen a Hess chart, there will be squares which are present and they would be subtending an angle of 5 degrees. Now, the patient would be asked to wear a red and green goggle. So it's a haploscopic test. The right eye, suppose if you're wearing the red goggle, and the left eye you are wearing the green glass of the goggle, what you are actually going to plot on the Hess chart is going to be your left eye. So we put a red target and the patient is asked to put the green light on the target. Now in doing so, we are trying to find out whether the patient is able to point at the same point or not. So it is going to take care of each and every muscle. So there are points which are covered for the medial rectus, for the lateral rectus, superior, inferior rectus, and superior and inferior oblique. The Hess chart, in which it's a smaller size of chart, it is the restrictive or the deviating eye, and where it's the higher or the bigger kind of chart that you see, it's the secondary overaction which you are seeing in the other eye. So when you want to plot the left eye chart, see to it that the right eye has the red lens, and you are holding the patient is holding a green colored marker to put it on the red point.
Okay. The next question is from Dr. Jacob. What are the causes of congenital third nerve palsy, and are the investigations warranted in those cases?
So causes of congenital third nerve palsy which I have seen are usually, it can be something as alarming as carotid cavernous fistula, but it can be small space occupying lesions like hemangiomas. So I would definitely say you should go in ahead with a neuroimaging to rule out any kind of space occupying lesion. We are not really expecting aneurysms in small kids, but any space occupying lesion would be pressing on the nerve, and that would be found out with congenital third nerve palsy.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I remember a flow chart for investigations in third nerve palsy. So it said that whether it is pupil sparing or pupil involving, irrespective, if the age of the patient is less than 40, then an MRI with a MRA is not wrong to be, means it is warranted.
It's not wrong. Any person only above 50 who has history of systemic disease, you would want to just wait and watch. Otherwise, definitely would go in for a neuroimaging.
Irrespective of the pupil involvement.
Irrespective of the pupil. Irrespective.
Definitely. And if that comes normal, then a lumbar puncture is warranted.
Then a lumbar puncture. That's correct. It's absolutely right.
The next question is, what are the uses of binasal patching of spectacles and the importance of checking both ductions and versions? I'm not getting it whether she has asked in relation to the fourth nerve or the third nerve. She has not mentioned that.
We normally do it for bitemporal hemianopia. So I don't think it's pertinent to third or fourth nerve palsy. And what else did she ask?
Please explain the importance of checking both ductions and versions in these paralytic squints.
Yeah, so in paralytic squints, what we see sometimes the ductions are restricted, but the versions are normal. So we want to look out whether it's a peripheral cause or it's a central cause. The central cause, both would be gone. The versions also and the ductions also.
And could you just explain how to record them in the exam? Means after they've checked their ductions and version, how to represent them on a case sheet,
piece of paper.
If you have it, you can just draw it and show.
Yeah, I'll draw it and show.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I request the PGs to keep dropping in their questions, and we are going to continue having these lecture series. If any suggestions are there, you can always drop in a WhatsApp message on the BOA PG group, or you can email us at boaisurgeon@gmail.com. And we plan to continue this lecture series even after the lockdown is lifted. I request you to spread this word among the PGs of other states, and let's have more questions coming in. Also, we are trying to figure out how to conduct a mock exam on this platform. So that's in the pipeline, and we would definitely appreciate your opinions on the same.
I don't know if I'm much more clear. So if you can
Yes, yes,
see,
yes.
I've drawn two parts, two extraocular movements, basically for the two eyes.
Yeah, we can see that clearly.
Right. So I'll just be
Just draw, suppose there is a right superior oblique palsy.
right.
How are you going to represent that?
Right.
We have a lot of questions coming up.
Right. So it would be something like this. It would be
Okay.
-3 here. So basically in depression and adduction, we are getting a superior oblique palsy. I mean, superior oblique is not functioning in the level of adduction as well as depression.
Thank you. Dr. Aparna is asking, what is skew deviation?
Yeah, so skew deviation is something that we see with thalamic kind of lesions. In that, we are expecting alternating hyperdeviation. That is, the right eye goes up, then gradually it goes down, and the left eye goes up. So it's called alternating hypertropia. But as I said, the only way usually it presents with a lot of cerebellar signs as well as thalamic signs. Like we will be having contralateral hemiparesis, usually seen in patients who have extradural hematoma, and they are those more serious kind of patients than actually how the fourth nerve palsy presents. Plus, there will be no torsion present in the skew deviation.
Okay, Dr. Jacob has asked one more question. Uh, are there any conditions where the ductions are full but the versions are limited?
Not really.
Okay, the next one, I'm just going fast so that we can cover many questions.
Right.
Again, Dr. Aparna wants you to just specify or probably demonstrate abnormal head positions in superior oblique as well as inferior oblique palsy. So probably you can face tilt, chin position, all that you can show.
Right. So if it's a superior oblique palsy, suppose
Let,
thinking about a right superior oblique palsy, so we are expecting that the right intortor, that is the superior oblique, is not working. So we will be having a contralateral head tilt and a chin up position like this.
yeah.
Right.
And inferior oblique?
Inferior oblique palsy. So we will be again having uh,
Right, right inferior oblique.
right inferior oblique palsy. Again, we'll be having a left tilt. However, we'll be having a down kind of chin down position.
Okay, great. Thank you. Uh, Here's one question from Dr. Sagar Patil. How to test fourth nerve and sixth nerve function clinically in a case of isolated third nerve palsy?
Correct. So when you have isolated third nerve palsy, lateral sixth nerve palsy is not sixth nerve is not a problem at all, because you'll be able to do the lateral rectal or the abduction very easily. The problem is only with the fourth nerve, because fourth nerve itself is superior oblique itself is a depressor. So you want to know whether that is functioning or not. So you make the patient sit on the slit lamp. You mark any of the limbal vessels or the corneal blood vessels, and you ask them to look down. Now, when you do that, and if the eyeball intorts, that means superior oblique is intact.
Okay. Can we go on to the next question?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the cause of Dr. Reed Gill is asking what is the cause of leash phenomena in Duane's retraction syndrome.
Right. So leash phenomenon is seen because of the extra, as we see that there is a misdirection. So whenever ideally what it is supposed to supply the sixth nerve nucleus, but it is not being supplied. So when you want to abduct, that part is going to the third nerve or the other adductor muscle, and that's why you see suddenly narrowing of the eyeball on adduction. So basically, it's just because of extra firing of the nerve, which was ideally supposed to supply the sixth nerve, but instead it's causing the wiring to go to the third nerve, and the eyeball contracts, or there is narrowing on adduction.
Is there any role of the two classic laws, Sherring's and Harrington, or it's not applicable over here?
It's not applicable over here in the leash phenomenon, not at all. For Duane's, it's a different kind of syndrome.
In nerve palsies, do you do an FDT test regularly in the OPD before taking up the patient for surgery, or only when restrictive pathology is suspected?
No, for every patient of nerve palsy who is going to be operated, a definitive post-duction test would be taken in. The reason being this, it's not only about you don't know whether this nerve palsy has been really for some time or for a very long time where it has caused contracture of the opposite muscle. So FDT is a compulsion in any kind of nerve palsy.
Okay, one more question from Dr. Gill. How long to wait for some spontaneous resolution of paralytic squint before intervening surgically?
6 months. So
6
at
months.
3 months, we call the patient. The first follow-up is at 3 months. If we are seeing signs of even a bit of improvement, like we do a Hess chart and we see that it is broadening, or clinically the patient's diplopia is going down and we see that the adductions are coming back, we wait for another 3 months. Before 6 months, we never touch in for the surgery in paralytic squints.
There are questions again and again on superior oblique face position. So Dr. Sushrut is asking, if superior oblique is a depressor, why is there a chin elevation?
Why is there a chin elevation? Because it is a chin depress. So what you want to do when you have a chin up position, the eye goes down. So it is compensating for the superior oblique, basically. Nothing else.
It's compensating for it's either a primary or the secondary action.
Action.
Okay. It's a comment or a question, I don't know. Grading of ocular movements in tertiary gaze. Question mark. That's the question from one of the PGs. Is there any grading of ocular movements in tertiary gaze?
Not that I know of. I don't know.
Great. Anything you want to add as a take-home message for the PGs? We have covered most of the time, and we had a good attendance. Of one point, it was 90 participants.
Okay.
And yeah, quick question from Dr. Hemendra Shah. What is the fourth step test? Park's fourth step test. There are 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, and the fourth step, they would want to check the torsion. So that's the fourth step for the Park's.
Okay. Again, there are questions pouring in just as we plan to close. Can you please explain once more how to check for cyclotorsion on the indirect ophthalmoscopy?
Right. So I think it will be better if I show it on a paper. That would go easier. So if we have a if you see, this is the optic nerve, and when you're making the patient lie down, so this is the picture that you are seeing. Now the foveal reflex will be between the top part of the disc as well as the upper 1/3 of the disc. It's going to be somewhere in between here. Now, if the foveal reflex comes here, that is just on the upper margin of the disc, we are saying it is slight excyclotorsion. I don't know how clear it is, but
It
it's
is clear.
excyclotorsion. However, there is something called +1, +2, +3. With every shift of 1/8 disc diameter, we are getting a +1, +2, +3, +4 excyclotorsion. So if you see that the foveal reflex is really above on the optic disc, somewhere here, we are saying it's a +4 excyclotorsion. Just to remind the PGs, this is an inverted image, what we are seeing. So because the eyeball rotates out, you would be seeing that the reflex is moving up and not down. So if it's an encyclotorsion, you will be seeing down the foveal reflex. Since it's an excyclotorsion, you will be seeing up. So a +1, +2, +3, +4, it depends on the 1/8 disc diameter you are going above from the normal foveal reflex point. So that's how you measure the excyclotorsion objectively.
So a lot of take-home messages, a lot of tips for the exams. Dr. Henry is asking, do we slightly undercorrect in all cases of nerve palsies?
Not really. We can, we don't undercorrect, we put them on adjustable sutures. That's the best way to go about, so that we can adjust them the next day. And whenever you are counseling for third nerve or any nerve palsy, we are telling them that there is definitely a possibility of diplopia. So we are keeping you on adjustable suture. And if there is a problem, we can always adjust the suture next day.
Okay, about the diagram which you have just drawn, was it for the right eye or the left eye? There is one question from Dr. Ansari. Right eye.
It's the right eye.
Okay. So one last question,
Right.
and it's again Dr. Shushruth who is asking, is the chin elevation depression in oblique palsies due to doll's eye phenomena? If yes, then why there is a head turn towards the same side? In say
head turn is towards the same side, he's saying.
It's not. No?
It's not.
It's the head turn is there only.
Head tilt is there on the contralateral side.
Yes.
You would never want it on the same side.
And is there any role of doll's eye phenomena in the face position in the oblique palsies?
No.
Okay. I think it was a very interactive session, and it made a very theoretical topic quite interesting. Again, a request for all of you to go through this video again and again. Keep your diagrams in front of you and listen to her. And these are very tricky questions, especially in the exam pressure. So you really need to be, because we don't see as many cases as cataract or glaucoma or that format of retinopathy. And these are quite rare cases, and we may not have enough time to examine the patients if it comes as a case. So especially neuro-ophthalmology has to be really, really at the back of your hand, and good theoretical knowledge goes a long way in having a quick evaluation of the patient. So thank you, Gargi. Any last points for the students?
Yeah, I would just say be very good with your anatomy. If you're good with your anatomy, you can do really well with the nerve palsies. They would really not be grinding you on the surgical part. They will be grinding you on the evaluation part. Like how do you take measurements? How do you do Maddox rod testing? Or how do you do a hair screen testing? And the neuroanat part. That's it.
Suppose you have reached the surgical management, that means you're doing well.
You're doing very well.
And Dr. Madhu is asking, are we going to archive these videos? Yes, all these videos are available on BOA YouTube channel, which has a name, BOA iTalk Plugged In. BOA iTalk Plugged In. So you please subscribe to the channel, and you would see not only the PG lectures, but also the senior BOA lectures on that channel. Thank you, Gargi, once again for joining in.
Yeah.
And have a good night, all of you.
Good night.